Hey everyone, welcome back to CreepyCorner Stories. You know, diving into the dark web is always risky, but sharing these stories with you makes it worth it. I'm curious, where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments below. I've noticed that these kinds of stories hit differently depending on where you are. It might even make the experience a little creepier. So, tell me, are you watching from the safety of your home or somewhere less secure? I accepted a dark web challenge to spend the night in an abandoned town. At midnight, I saw something land in the town square. So, here's how it started. I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but if you're reading this, I need you to take it seriously. Like, don't shrug it off as one of those fake stories people post for clout or karma. This happened to me. It's real, and I'm still trying to process it. I was scrolling through Reddit late one night. Classic 2 a.m. insomniac vibes. You know how it is. You're lying in bed, pretending you'll go to sleep soon, but instead, you're 30 posts deep in arg or creepy, questioning your life choices. Then, I stumbled upon a thread in r/dark web adventures. Most of the time, it's just people bragging about buying random junk from sketchy websites, or making up stories about finding cursed VHS tapes. But this post, it was different. The user, who went by After the Sunset 9, had posted a challenge. The premise was simple. Spend one night in an abandoned town called Hollow's Ridge. Apparently, it was one of those towns that just vanished. Like people packed up and left overnight, leaving everything behind. You know, the type you see in documentaries about ghost towns. But here's the kicker. No one really knows why it was abandoned. It's not on Google Maps anymore, but there are old forums and articles about it if you dig deep enough. The town's been totally wiped from the modern internet. No TikToks, no urban explorers doing hashtag ghost town challenges. Nothing. The reward for completing the challenge? $10,000. Yeah, I know. It's the oldest scam in the book. But the thing is, the user posted proof. Bank transactions, screenshots, all of it. Apparently, a few people had tried it before and succeeded. They got paid. No strings attached. The catch? No one ever heard from them again after they cashed in. Weird, right? But hey, I was broke. Rent was due. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? Some creepy dudes tried to scare me. Maybe a rabid raccoon. Whatever. I could handle it. I messaged the guy, and he responded almost immediately. He gave me directions, a set of rules, and a specific time to arrive. His tone was super weird, formal, like he was some kind of lawyer or something. He told me not to bring anyone with me, not to take anything from the town, and under no circumstances was I to leave before sunrise. If I broke any of the rules, the challenge would be null and void, and I wouldn't get paid. Looking back, I should have realized how insane this was. But like I said, I was desperate. And okay, maybe a little curious. I froze. My heart felt like it was about to rip through my chest. That scratching sound, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical, like nails dragging across wood in slow, calculated strokes. I backed up a few steps, shining my flashlight on the crate, my mind racing. What the hell could be inside? An animal. Number. It sounded too controlled, too human. The scratching stopped. Then came a single knock. I kid you not. Someone, or something, knocked from inside the crate. It was soft, almost polite, like they were waiting for me to respond. My brain screamed at me to leave, to run back to my car and floor it out of there. but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the ground. It's like my body was stuck in some kind of fight or flight glitch, but neither option was working. Another knock, louder this time. I forced myself to whisper, "Who's there?" No response, just silence. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a voice, but not like a normal voice. This one sounded off, distorted, like someone trying to talk through a busted walkie-talkie. It said, "Open it." Hell no. Absolutely not. I took another step back, nearly tripping over the curb. "I'm not opening anything," I said, my voice trembling. Who are you? What do you want?" No answer, just a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. Then, the voice spoke again. "If you don't open it, I'll open you." Yeah, I don't even know what that means, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I turned and ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand. The diner wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and shallow, echoing in the stillness of the night. And behind me, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. I didn't dare look back. The stranger in the diner. When I burst back into the diner, I slammed the door shut and shoved a metal stool against it as a makeshift barricade. I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't bother pulling it out. No service. No one to call. I was completely alone. Or so I thought. As I turned to look around, my flashlight beam landed on something, or someone, sitting in one of the booths. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. It was slouched over, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its skin was pale, almost waxy. But then it moved. Slowly, its head jerked up, and I realized I was looking at a man, or what used to be a man. His eyes were wrong. They were pitch black, no whites, just endless voids that seemed to swallow the light. His mouth was stretched into a too-wide grin, his teeth yellow and jagged. He wore a filthy suit, like something out of the 1950s, and his hands, oh God, his hands were covered in blood. Not just smears, but thick, glistening pools of it dripping onto the table. "Welcome back," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't have left." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen, as he slowly rose to his feet. He was tall, unnaturally tall, his head nearly brushing the ceiling, and his movements were jerky, like a marionette being yanked around by invisible strings. "Did you hear it?" he asked, tilting his head like a curious child. "Did you hear the scratching?" I managed to stammer. "Whoa, what are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step toward me, and that's when I noticed the thing in his hand. A knife. Not a normal kitchen knife, though. This one was old, rusted, and curved, like something you'd see in a museum or a torture chamber. "You were chosen," he said, his grin widening. "Do you understand what that means?" I shook my head, backing up until I hit the counter. My fingers fumbled for something, anything I could use as a weapon. The baseball bat was still in my bag, but it might as well have been on the moon. I grabbed a plate instead, holding it out like a shield. "Stay the hell away from me," I said, my voice cracking. He laughed. Not a normal laugh, but a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "It's already too late," he said. "You shouldn't have touched the crate. Now, you belong to us." They were inside. The room was no longer empty. It was filled with them. The figures in the filthy suits, the same ones I'd seen outside. They stood in the booths, sat at the counter, loitered near the broken jukebox. Some were slouched like lifeless puppets. while others stared directly at me, their black, void-like eyes glinting under the weak fluorescent lights. Their grins were wider now, too wide for human faces, splitting their cheeks like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, my breath shallow and shaky. There were at least 20 of them now, maybe more. None of them spoke, but their heads tilted in unison, like they were silently examining me, waiting. Then one of them, a woman with long, stringy hair matted to her face, took a step forward. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her joints didn't work right. Her head cocked to the side, and her grin stretched even wider, revealing rows of teeth that didn't look like they belonged in a human mouth. They were sharp, too sharp. "Why are you running?" she asked, her voice crackling like an old radio transmission. "You came here, didn't you? You accepted the challenge." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't even comprehend how she knew that. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just kept backing away, my eyes darting between her and the others. Every time I moved, they twitched, not walked or shuffled, twitched, like their bodies were being rewired in real time, glitching as they tried to figure out how to follow me. "You don't belong here," she said, taking another step. Her head twitched violently, like her neck was on the verge of snapping. "But you touched the crate. That means you're one of us now." I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. My mind raced. This isn't happening. This can't be real. But it was. Every inch of my body told me it was. The blood trail. I bolted for the kitchen. My only thought was to put as much distance between me and them as possible. The second I crossed through the swinging door, the lights in the diner flickered again, and I heard them start to move. Not footsteps, though. It sounded more like dragging, like their feet weren't lifting off the floor, just scraping along the tiles as they followed me. The kitchen was disgusting. Rusted appliances, mold growing along the walls, puddles of something sticky and dark pooling on the floor. I nearly slipped as I ran to the back door, but when I reached it, my stomach sank. The door wouldn't budge. I threw my weight against it, twisting the lock, yanking the handle, but it was like it had been welded shut. Behind me, I could hear them. The dragging sounds were getting louder, closer, accompanied by a low, guttural hum. Not quite a chant, but not far off. I turned to look, and my heart nearly stopped. One of them was crawling through the kitchen door. Not walking, crawling. Their limbs bent the wrong way, their hands and feet skittering across the floor like a spider. It was the woman from before. Her face was still twisted into that horrific grin. Her black eyes locked onto me as she dragged herself forward. "You can't leave," she said, her voice warped and echoing. "We're in you now." I grabbed a cast iron skillet from the counter and held it out in front of me, like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling. I'll kill you." Her grin didn't falter. She tilted her head again, her neck making a sickening crack, and then she laughed. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was deep, wet, almost guttural, like it was bubbling up from inside her chest. "You can't kill what's already dead," she said. And then she lunged. I swung the skillet as hard as I could, and it connected with her head with a sickening thunk. Her body crumpled to the floor, but before I could even process what I'd done, she started to twitch. Her limbs jerked violently, her head snapping back and forth, and she began to rise. Not stand, rise. Like an invisible force was lifting her by the strings of some unseen puppet master. I ran. There was no plan, no thought, just blind panic. I sprinted through the kitchen, slipping and sliding in the puddles of God knows what, and burst through a side door that led to the alley behind the diner. The town comes alive. The alley was worse, much worse. The streets of Hollows Ridge were no longer empty. Figures like the ones in the diner were everywhere. Some of them stood still, staring at me with those hollow black eyes. Others wandered aimlessly, their heads twitching and jerking as they dragged themselves through the streets. The whole town was alive now, a hive of these things, and they were all turning toward me. In the middle of the square, the crate was open. The wood had been splintered apart, and something was slithering out of it. At first, I thought it was smoke, but then I realized it was moving too deliberately. It looked like a shadow, but it wasn't attached to anything. It crawled across the ground like liquid darkness, spreading out in tendrils that snaked toward the buildings, the streetlights, everything. As the tendrils touched the figures, they began to move faster, more coordinated, like the shadow was controlling them. And then I saw it, the thing that had been inside the crate. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a writhing mass of shadows that flickered and warped like static on a broken TV. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was just a void, an endless black hole that seemed to pull the light out of the air around it. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at me, watching me. It raised one long clawed arm and pointed directly at me. "Run!" it said. Its voice wasn't loud, but it echoed through the entire town, deep and resonant, like it was coming from inside my own head. I didn't need to be told twice. I took off down the street, dodging the figures as they reached for me with their bloodied, broken hands. Some of them screamed as I passed, their voices high-pitched and animalistic, while others just laughed, their grins splitting their faces even further. The house on the hill. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw it. A house at the edge of town, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. It didn't make sense. The rest of the town was abandoned, but this house looked lived in. Desperate, I sprinted toward it, throwing myself against the front door and pounding on it with both fists. "Help!" I screamed. "Please, let me in." The door creaked open, and an old man stood there, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in years, his eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I didn't hesitate. The second I was inside, he slammed the door shut and bolted it with what looked like a dozen heavy locks. Then he turned to me, his expression grim. "You touched the crate, didn't you?" he said. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "What the hell is happening?" I asked. "What are those things? What's in the crate?" He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a knife, a long, jagged blade that looked like it had been forged in some ancient blacksmith shop. "You can't kill them," he said, "but you can slow them down, and you'll need to, because they're not going to stop." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Stop what?" He looked me dead in the eyes, his expression hollow. "Taking you." Before I could respond, the windows shattered, and they began to pour in. The windows exploded inward like they'd been hit by a bomb. Shards of glass rained down, glinting in the dim light of the house. I barely had time to duck as the first of them crawled through. One of the suited figures, its black eyes fixated on me like I was the only thing that mattered in the universe. The old man didn't flinch. He moved faster than I thought a person his age could. Before the thing could fully climb inside, He was on it, driving the jagged knife into its chest. I expected blood, or at least some kind of reaction, but instead, the figure let out a high-pitched wail that sounded like metal scraping against metal. Its body convulsed, jerking violently, as a thick, inky substance oozed from the wound. The old man yanked the knife out and kicked the thing back through the window. "That won't kill them," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But it'll slow them down. You get hit, you don't get back up." I didn't have time to ask what he meant. More of them were already forcing their way in, their bodies contorting unnaturally to squeeze through the broken windows and gaps in the walls. One of them, the woman from the diner, was climbing headfirst down the ceiling, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. Her grin was wider than ever, stretching so far it split the skin at the corners of her mouth, revealing raw flesh underneath. The old man shoved the knife into my hand. "If you want to live, you fight." I didn't have a choice. One of the creatures lunged at me, its arms outstretched. I swung the knife without thinking, catching it across the face. The blade didn't cut like a normal knife. It felt like it was burning through the creature's flesh, leaving a sizzling, blackened wound in its wake. The thing screamed, staggering backward, and I took the opportunity to stab it in the chest. It collapsed to the floor, twitching and writhing as that same inky black substance spilled out of it. "Don't stop," the old man barked. "They'll keep coming until you're one of them." The house turns against us. The room was a whirlwind of chaos. The creatures were everywhere, crawling through every opening, their bodies bending and breaking in ways that defied logic. The old man fought like he'd done this 1,000 times before, his movements precise and unrelenting. But for everyone we took down, 2 more seemed to take its place. And then the house itself began to change. The walls started to bleed. I'm not being dramatic. I mean literal, red, wet blood. It seeped out of the cracks in the plaster, dripping down in thick rivulets that pooled on the floor. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of copper and decay. The light bulbs flickered wildly, casting the room in strobes of light and shadow that made everything feel even more surreal. One of the creatures, the largest I'd seen so far, lurched toward me. It wasn't wearing a suit like the others. Instead, its body was covered in torn, rotting flesh, its ribs exposed, black veins crawling across its skin like roots. Its face was featureless, just a smooth expanse of flesh, where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. But I could feel it looking at me. I swung the knife, but it caught my wrist with one impossibly strong hand, twisting it until I thought the bones would snap. Its other hand reached for my face, its fingers elongating into razor-sharp claws. I screamed, kicking and struggling, but it was like trying to fight a steel trap. The old man appeared out of nowhere, driving his knife into the creature's back. It let out a guttural roar, dropping me as it spun around to face him. He shoved me aside, shouting, "Get upstairs, now." I didn't argue. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the staircase, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard the old man yelling something I couldn't make out, followed by the wet sound of flesh being torn apart. I didn't look back. The room with no exit, the upstairs hallway, was impossibly long, far longer than the house should have allowed. Doors lined both sides, each one identical, each one slightly ajar. The walls here were different too. They weren't bleeding like downstairs. Instead, they were covered in, I don't even know what to call it. It looked like skin, pale, veined skin stretched taut over the wooden framework, pulsing faintly as if it were alive. I picked a door at random and shoved it open, slamming it shut behind me. The room was empty, except for a single chair in the middle and a mirror on the far wall. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, the knife still clutched tightly in my hand. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something burning, but it grew stronger with every passing second. I turned toward the mirror and froze. There was something wrong with my reflection. At first glance, I thought it was just me. Same clothes, same face. But as I stared, I realized my reflection wasn't moving the same way I was. It was subtle at first. A delayed blink, a slight tilt of the head when I wasn't moving. But then it smiled. I wasn't smiling. The reflection's grin spread slowly across its face. Too wide, too unnatural, until it looked like the same grotesque grin the creatures wore. Its eyes darkened, the whites fading into an inky black void. And then it spoke. "You can't hide," it said, its voice warped and echoing, like the woman from the diner. "We see you." I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass, as if it were trying to push through. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, and black liquid began to seep out, dripping onto the floor. Before I could react, the door behind me flew open, and one of the creatures burst into the room. It was smaller than the others, hunched and emaciated, but it moved faster. Too fast. It was on me in an instant, knocking me to the ground. Its hands wrapped around my throat, its claws digging into my skin. I stabbed wildly with the knife, my vision blurring as I struggled to breathe. The blade sank into the creature's side, and it let out a shriek that rattled my skull. I shoved it off me, gasping for air, and drove the knife into its chest. It twitched violently, the black ooze spraying everywhere, and then it went still. The reflection in the mirror laughed. The clock strikes midnight. I staggered to my feet, covered in the creature's blood. The room was spinning, the walls pulsing, as if the entire house was alive. The mirror was now completely black, the cracks glowing faintly, like molten lava. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The hallway was worse now. The skin on the walls had started to tear, revealing raw, bloody muscle underneath. The floor squelched beneath my feet, and the air was thick with the sound of whispers. Hundreds of voices, all overlapping, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. At the far end of the hallway, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. It wasn't one of the creatures. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body flickering like static on an old TV. Its face was a swirling void, just like the thing I'd seen in the town square. It raised a hand, and the whispers stopped. Then it spoke. "You belong to us now." The lights flickered once, then went out completely. The darkness wasn't like normal darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was oppressive, alive. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, but I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on me, seeping into my skin. The whispers were back now, louder, but distorted and overlapping like a broken record. My legs trembled as I tried to move, blindly reaching for anything solid to hold onto. And then I felt it. A hand. Not just any hand. It was cold, clammy, the texture of decayed flesh. The fingers wrapped around my wrist, their grip like iron. I screamed and yanked my arm away, stumbling backward into the hallway wall. The skin-like surface gave way, tearing under my weight, and I fell through it into another room. This room wasn't like the others. It was enormous, far larger than the house should have allowed, and the walls were lined with shelves full of jars. Hundreds, maybe thousands of jars, each filled with a murky liquid and something floating inside. I stumbled to my feet, clutching the knife in one hand and squinting at the nearest jar. Inside was a face. Not a head, just a face, flayed clean off and suspended in the liquid like some kind of grotesque trophy. Its eyes were still intact, staring blankly out at me, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. My stomach churned as I realized every single jar held the same thing. A face, perfectly preserved, all of them twisted in expressions of terror. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I noticed the table in the center of the room. It was covered in tools, knives, scalpels, saws, all of them stained with blood, and next to them, a single wooden mask. It wasn't a mask in the traditional sense. It was crudely made, carved from splintered wood, with jagged edges and holes for eyes and a mouth. But the wood was soaked with something dark, and the edges of the mask seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were breathing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the mask itself, drawing me toward it. My hands trembled as I reached out, almost involuntarily. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, a sharp, searing pain shot through my head, like a spike being driven into my skull. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head as the room began to shift around me. The ritual. When I looked up, I wasn't in the house anymore. I was back in the town square, but it was wrong. The buildings were twisted, leaning at impossible angles, their windows glowing with a sickly green light. The crate was back, but now it was surrounded by figures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They stood in a perfect circle, their black eyes fixed on me, their mouths moving silently in unison. At the center of the circle, towering over everything, was the thing from before, the shadow-like entity with the void for a face. Its body shifted constantly, flickering between forms. A man, a woman, a child, a mass of writhing limbs. It raised one clawed hand, and the figures surrounding it began to chant. The sound was indescribable, not words, but something deeper, something that vibrated in my chest and made my teeth ache. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the ground itself was holding me in place. The entity tilted its head, as if studying me, and then spoke in that deep, resonant voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You were chosen," it said. "You opened the door." The figures began to move closer, their grins impossibly wide, their hands outstretched. I gripped the knife tighter, my mind racing. There has to be a way out. There has to be. That's when I noticed the old man. He was standing on the edge of the circle, his face pale and drawn. He wasn't smiling like the others. He looked broken, defeated. But when our eyes met, he mouthed a single word. "Fight." The last stand. The figures were almost on me now. I could see the black veins crawling beneath their pale skin, their nails jagged and broken, their eyes empty pits. One of them lunged, and I swung the knife, the blade slicing through its throat. Black ichor sprayed everywhere, and the figure collapsed, convulsing violently before going still. The others hesitated for a moment, then surged forward all at once. I fought like a wild animal, stabbing and slashing, the knife burning through their flesh like acid. But for everyone I took down, 3 more took its place. Their hands clawed at me, tearing into my skin, their laughter echoing in my ears. I was losing. I knew it. My arms felt like lead, My vision blurred from exhaustion and blood loss, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The mask. It was lying on the ground, just outside the circle. The whispers were louder now, urging me toward it. I didn't have a choice. I broke free of the figures, sprinting toward the mask, and grabbed it with both hands. The moment I put it on, everything changed, becoming one. The world around me dissolved into chaos. The figures froze, their bodies contorting as if in pain. The shadow entity let out a deafening roar, its form flickering wildly, and then I felt it, the mask digging into my face, fusing with my skin. The pain was unbearable, like my entire head was being set on fire. But with the pain came power. I could see everything now. The town, the creatures, the entity. They were all connected, all part of the same thing. And I was part of it too. I could feel the darkness spreading through me, filling me with something ancient and terrible. The figures began to move again, but this time they weren't attacking. They were kneeling. The entity stepped forward, its void-like face inches from mine. "You are one of us now," it said. "You will carry us." I tried to scream, to resist, but it was too late. The mask had taken over. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection in a shard of broken glass. It wasn't me anymore. Aftermath, I woke up in my car, parked on the side of a highway. The sun was rising, the sky streaked with orange and pink. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw it, the mask. It wasn't on my face anymore, but it was still there, sitting on the passenger seat, its jagged edges glinting in the morning light. And in the distance, on the horizon, I could see Hollow's Ridge. The town was still there, waiting. And so were they. I don't know what's going to happen now. I don't know if I can stop it, or if I even want to. All I know is that I've started seeing the figures at the grocery store, outside my apartment, in the reflection of my TV screen. They're watching me, smiling, and I can feel the darkness inside me growing stronger every day. I accepted a dark web challenge to spend the night in a ghost town. At midnight, I heard laughter coming from the church. Alright, so before I get into this, let me just say, yeah, I know. This is one of those don't try this at home kind of deals. But in my defense, I didn't think it was actually real. I mean, I'd heard about the dark web before. Who hasn't? It's all those creepy stories floating around on Reddit or YouTube, where people talk about cursed websites, secret snuff films, and government conspiracies. But I figured it was just urban legend stuff, you know, nothing actually real. Anyway, I was bored out of my mind one Friday night. My friends were all busy. I was scrolling through TikTok, and nothing interesting was happening. So, naturally, I went down the internet rabbit hole. One link led to another, and before I knew it, I was on this forum that I probably shouldn't name here, but let's just say it was like the back alley of the internet. People were talking about challenges, like stay overnight in a haunted house, or summon a demon, which okay, seemed fake as hell. But one thread caught my eye. It was called the Midnight Ghost Town Challenge. The post didn't have much detail, just a short paragraph and a location link. It said, if you're brave enough, spend one night alone in Cedar Pines, a ghost town out in the middle of nowhere. Make it until sunrise, and you'll win $10,000. But if you leave before 6 a.m., you forfeit the prize. DM for details. And then there were comments. Some were like, "This is BS," or "fake challenge." But a few people were claiming they'd tried it, and weird stuff happened. Someone said they saw shadows moving without anything there. Another claimed they heard voices, and one guy swore he felt something grab him in the dark. The weirdest part? All those people stopped replying after a while, like they just dropped off the face of the earth. I don't know why, but my dumb adrenaline junkie self thought, sure, why not? It's not like I had anything better to do, and $10,000 for one night sounded pretty sweet. Plus, I figured worst case scenario, I'd spend a creepy night in an abandoned place and leave with a cool story to tell. So, I messaged the original poster. Within minutes, I got a reply. It was just a set of instructions, a map link, and a list of rules. Arrive by 8 p.m. Stay inside the ghost town limits. Do not enter the church until midnight. Document your experience. Photos, videos optional. Leave only at sunrise, 6 a.m. Oh, and there was one last thing. By accepting this challenge, you take full responsibility for any consequences. No liability on our part. Looking back, I should have been smarter. That line alone screamed red flags, but I brushed it off. I figured the whole thing was just a gimmick. So, I grabbed my GoPro, packed some snacks, and set out for Cedar Pines. The drive there was eerie. The closer I got, the more desolate it became. The highway stretched out into the middle of nowhere, and my GPS kept cutting in and out. Eventually, I hit a dirt road, and that's when the real unease started to creep in. The trees on either side felt way too dense, like they were swallowing the road. It was pitch black, except for my headlights, and I swear I saw something dart across the road at one point. Probably just a deer, but it made my heart jump. When I finally pulled up to Cedar Pines, it was exactly what I expected, and somehow worse. Picture a classic old western ghost town, weathered wooden buildings, saloon doors hanging crookedly, a dry fountain in the middle of the square. But there was no wind, no sound. It was completely still. I parked my car just outside the town limits and stepped out, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. I glanced at my phone. It was 8:03 p.m. Perfect timing. I took a deep breath, turned on my GoPro, and started exploring. At first, it wasn't so bad. Creepy, sure, but not terrifying. Most of the buildings were boarded up, but I managed to peek inside a few. There was a general store with shelves still stocked with old, rusted cans, like people just left one day and never came back. I found a schoolhouse with broken desks and a chalkboard that still had the faint outline of writing on it. "Do your best," it said, in this shaky, ghostly handwriting. That gave me chills, but again, nothing too crazy. Then I saw the church. It was the tallest building in the town, looming at the end of the main street like some kind of grim watchtower. The steeple was crooked, and the wooden cross at the top was barely hanging on. I felt this weird pull toward it, like it was watching me, but I remembered the rule. Don't go in until midnight. So, I kept my distance. As the night dragged on, the weirdness started to kick up. It was little stuff at first. I kept hearing these faint whispers, like someone calling my name from just beyond the flashlight's reach. A soft, "Hey, over here." But every time I turned, there was nothing. I tried to laugh it off, saying, "Nice try, ghost town," into the camera, but my voice sounded shaky even to me. Around 11 p.m., I decided to take a break and sit by the fountain. That's when I noticed something strange. My car. I'd left it parked outside the town, right where I could see it from the square. But now, it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there. I tried not to panic. Maybe I'd parked it further down the road than I thought. Maybe someone was messing with me. But then I remembered the terms of the challenge. Whoever posted it said they weren't responsible for any consequences. Was this part of it? Some sick joke to mess with my head? I sat there for a while, my heart pounding, and that's when I noticed something even worse. The laughter. It started faint, barely audible, but it grew louder and louder, echoing from the direction of the church. It wasn't happy laughter. It was warped, distorted, like someone laughing and choking at the same time. The sound crawled under my skin, made the hairs on my neck stand up. I looked at my watch. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until midnight. Against every ounce of better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the church. I had to know. I don't know what came over me as I walked toward the church. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, like I didn't even have a choice in the matter. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back to where my car should have been, and just take the L. But that laughter, the way it echoed through the night, it was like it hooked into my brain and reeled me in. When I reached the church doors, they were wide open. I swear they hadn't been before. The air spilling out of the building was colder than outside, which didn't make any sense, because the night wasn't even that chilly to begin with. It was like stepping into a freezer. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness inside, but the first thing I noticed was the pews. They were all smashed, not like they'd rotted over time or been abandoned for years. No, these were destroyed violently. Shards of wood littered the floor, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them in a fit of rage. The walls had these weird scratch marks carved into them, long and jagged, like an animal had gone berserk. And the smell. God, the smell. It was this sickening mix of mildew and something metallic, like copper, but stronger. It hit the back of my throat and made me gag. I aimed the flashlight down at the floor and froze. There were footprints, bare footprints, but the shape wasn't normal. They were too long, the toes stretched out like claws. The tracks led down the aisle, straight to the pulpit, and behind the pulpit was a set of stairs leading downward. The laughter was louder now. It wasn't coming from the church itself, but somewhere beneath it. The sound wasn't alone anymore either. It was mixed with whispers, dozens of them, all overlapping, like a swarm of voices trying to outdo each other. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like my name was buried in the chaos. I should have turned back right then and there. No amount of money is worth this kind of nightmare. But something about the stairs drew me in, like they were daring me to come closer. I stepped around the debris and descended. The stairs were narrow and creaky, but they seemed to go on forever, spiraling downward into the earth. My flashlight flickered as I walked, which was just great. Exactly the kind of thing you want when you're stuck in a haunted ghost town. The deeper I went, the colder it got, until I could see my breath in front of me. The whispers followed me, or maybe they were ahead of me. It was impossible to tell. The further I went, the more the walls seemed to close in, pressing around me, like the church itself was alive and didn't want me there. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. It wasn't a basement like I'd expected. It was a massive cavern, way too big to exist naturally, under a tiny ghost town church. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp, and the air down there was heavy, like breathing through a wet towel. My flashlight finally steadied, but I almost wished it hadn't, because now I could see the full scope of the room. There were bones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scattered everywhere. Most were small, like animal bones, but some weren't. Human skulls stuck out from the piles, some still with bits of skin clinging to them, like they hadn't fully decomposed. I spotted rib cages, femurs, and something that might have been a spine coiled up like a snake. In the center of the room, there was a large stone altar. It was stained dark, almost black, with what could only be dried blood. Chains dangled from the sides, each one ending in a manacle that was too small for a human wrist, but too big for an animal's leg. On the altar was a single object, a small leather-bound book. It looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd see in a museum behind thick glass. The edges of the pages were frayed, and there was something drawn on the cover, a symbol that didn't make sense. It looked like a cross, but twisted, with extra arms spiraling outward like some kind of warped spiderweb. The laughter stopped the second I stepped into the room. Dead silence fell over everything. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I moved toward the altar, my footsteps crunching on the bones beneath me. The book seemed to hum, almost like it was alive. I didn't want to touch it, but my hands felt drawn to it, like magnets. As soon as my fingers brushed the leather, the whispers exploded back to life, louder, angrier. The cavern felt like it was shaking, dust falling from the ceiling, as if the earth was going to collapse on top of me. But it wasn't just the voices. There was something else now. Movement. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room, but I didn't see anything at first. Then I noticed the shadows, how they didn't match the shape of the bones, or the altar, or anything else. They were stretching across the walls, growing longer, thicker, until they detached entirely. One by one, the shadows rose up, forming shapes. They didn't look human. They were tall, with impossibly long limbs and no faces, just smooth, featureless heads that tilted as they stared at me, or at least I think they were staring. Their bodies were hunched, bony, and as they moved, their joints cracked like dry branches snapping in the wind. I backed up, nearly tripping over a rib cage. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second they were closer, much closer. I grabbed the book and ran. The moment my hand closed around the book, everything changed. The whispers stopped, the laughter vanished, and the shadows froze where they stood. For a second, I thought I was safe. Then I heard it, the sound of chains rattling. It was coming from the altar. I turned, and my stomach dropped. The manacles were moving, slithering like snakes, and something was rising from beneath the altar. It was a hand. No, not a hand. A claw. The skin was gray and mottled, like it had been burned, and the fingers were tipped with jagged black nails. Another claw followed, and then a face. I can barely describe it. It was hollow, like the skin was stretched too tight over the bones, with sunken eye sockets that glowed faintly red. Its mouth was filled with teeth, too many teeth, sharp and uneven, like they'd been shoved into a space too small for them. It grinned at me, and the sound of it, the creak of its jaw opening, made me want to vomit. I didn't stick around to see the rest of it. I tore up the stairs, clutching the book like my life depended on it. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, and I swear the shadows were chasing me, reaching for me. When I burst back into the church, The door slammed shut behind me, and the laughter returned. Only this time, it was everywhere. It wasn't until I was back outside, gasping for air, that I realized I still had no way to leave. My car was gone, my phone had no signal, and the sun wasn't rising anytime soon. And then, I saw it. At the edge of the square, standing in the moonlight, was one of the shadow figures. It tilted its head, almost curiously, before raising one long skeletal arm and pointing at the church. The laughter grew louder. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen, staring at the shadow figure, pointing back at the church. The laughter, it wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was bouncing off the buildings, echoing down the empty streets of Cedar Pines, growing louder and louder until it felt like the whole town was alive, mocking me. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed at the figure, "What do you want?" But it didn't move. It just kept pointing, like it knew something I didn't, like it was waiting. I didn't go back into the church. Screw that. Instead, I turned and ran, heading straight down the main street, deeper into the town. The farther I got, the quieter the laughter became, like it was fading into the distance. My flashlight jittered with every step, throwing strange, shifting shadows across the old wooden storefronts and crumbling saloon walls. Every now and then, I'd swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, like someone ducking behind a window or a door. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the windless, empty streets. The first building I ducked into was what looked like an old hotel. The sign above the door was barely legible, the paint faded and peeling. The Cedar Pines Inn. Inside, it was pitch black, my flashlight barely enough to make out the room around me. Dust hung thick in the air, clinging to every surface. The floor was covered in what looked like dried mud. Or maybe it wasn't mud. I didn't want to think too hard about it. The lobby was trashed, furniture overturned, the reception desk smashed to splinters. There were still guest registers scattered across the floor, the names smudged and unreadable. I was about to move deeper into the building when I heard something, a faint tapping sound, like nails on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from upstairs. My heart dropped, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. The staircase at the far end of the lobby creaked loudly as I climbed, the sound echoing through the emptiness. Every step felt like it was giving me away, like I was announcing to whatever was in the hotel that I was here. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with doors. Most of them were closed, but a few hung open, revealing glimpses of decayed furniture and broken mirrors inside. The tapping sound continued, louder now, coming from one of the open rooms. I moved toward it, my flashlight trembling in my grip. When I reached the doorway, the tapping stopped. The room was empty, just an old bed frame, a shattered window, and a hole in the ceiling where moonlight poured through. But something didn't feel right. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the building, and there was this faint smell, like burnt hair. I stepped inside. That's when I noticed the writing. It was on the walls, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, or maybe something darker. The words were jumbled, overlapping, running into each other, but one sentence stood out, repeated over and over. They never leave. I was about to back out of the room when I heard it again. The tapping. Only this time, it was behind me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly. At the end of the hallway, a figure stood in the shadows. Not one of the tall, faceless things from the cavern. This was different. Smaller, human-shaped, but wrong. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its arms hung too long at its sides. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it watching me. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs refused to work, like they were locked in place. And then it started walking. The way it moved was wrong, jerky, almost puppet-like, its limbs twisting in ways they shouldn't. Every step it took, the floorboards creaked louder than they should have, like the sound was amplified somehow. It was halfway down the hall when it stopped and raised one hand. It pointed, just like the shadow figure had outside, but this time it was pointing at me. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second it was closer. I don't remember how I got out of the hotel. 1 second I was standing in that hallway, staring at the thing pointing at me, and the next I was back on the street, gasping for air. The book was still clutched in my hand, its leather cover slick with sweat. The laughter was back, louder than ever, but this time it wasn't coming from the church. It was everywhere, spilling out of every building, echoing through the empty streets. And then I saw them. The shadow figures were everywhere now. They lined the rooftops, the windows, the alleyways, dozens of them, maybe more, their long limbs and blank faces illuminated by the pale moonlight. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. I backed away, trying to keep them in my sight, but the laughter was making it hard to think. It felt like it was coming from inside my head now, drilling into my brain, twisting my thoughts. I clutched the book tighter, hoping it might protect me somehow, but it only seemed to make things worse. The symbols on the cover started to glow faintly, pulsing in time with the laughter. I stumbled into another building, a diner by the looks of it. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the inside was just as trashed as the hotel. Booths were ripped apart, tables overturned, and the counter was smeared with something dark and sticky. Flies buzzed around a pile of rotting meat on one of the tables, and the smell hit me like a brick wall. There was a jukebox in the corner, its glass cracked but still intact. As soon as I stepped inside, it flickered to life, blasting an old, distorted country song that I didn't recognize. The sound was warped, the lyrics dragging like the record was melting. I slammed my hand against it, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't stop. The song just kept playing, growing louder and louder until it drowned out the laughter entirely. And then the voices started. They came from the kitchen at the back of the diner. Low, murmuring voices, overlapping like the whispers from the cavern. They didn't sound human. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was wrong. Too deep, too guttural, like growls mixed with words. I crept toward the kitchen, my flashlight barely holding steady. The door was partially open, and through the crack, I could see movement. Shadows dancing across the walls, shifting unnaturally. The voices grew louder as I pushed the door open, and what I saw inside made my blood run cold. The kitchen was covered in blood. It dripped from the walls, pooled on the floor, smeared across the counters. Hanging from the ceiling were hooks, dozens of them, swinging gently as if something had just been removed. The air was thick with the stench of death, and in the center of the room, crouched over a pile of what looked like human remains, was something. It was humanoid, but barely. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones. Its spine arched unnaturally as it tore into the flesh with long, sharp teeth. When it turned to look at me, its eyes were black, endless pits that seemed to suck in the light. Its mouth was too wide, splitting almost to its ears, and it grinned at me, blood dripping from its teeth. The voices stopped, the jukebox cut off, and in the silence, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." I don't know how I got out of there. I remember running, crashing through the door, the laughter following me as I tore down the street. The shadow figures were gone, but I could feel them watching, their presence pressing down on me like a weight. When I finally stopped, I was back in the town square. The church doors were open again, and standing in front of them was the shadow figure from before. It raised its arm one last time and pointed at the book in my hands. The laughter reached a crescendo, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in the middle of the town square. My head throbbed, my ears were ringing, and for a few horrifying moments, I thought I was blind. Everything was dark, suffocatingly dark. It wasn't until I managed to grope around for my flashlight, which had miraculously stayed intact, that I realized the world hadn't gone black. I was just alone in a mist so thick it felt like it was alive, wrapping around me like a living thing. The book was still in my hands, clutched so tightly that my fingers ached. I looked down at it and froze. The warped cross-like symbol on the cover had changed. The spiraling arms now curled inward, forming a crude, jagged circle. Inside the circle were markings, letters maybe, but in no language I recognized. They pulsed faintly with a dim red glow, almost like they were breathing. I tried to toss the book away, but my hands wouldn't listen. It was as if the leather had fused to my palms, the sensation of the material sinking deeper into my skin. I screamed and pulled at it, desperate to free myself, but the book wouldn't budge. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not one set, many. I spun around, my flashlight barely cutting through the fog. The footsteps were coming from all directions, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever. It was wanted me to know they were there. My chest tightened as shadowy figures began to emerge from the mist, one by one, surrounding me. At first, I thought they were the same faceless shadows from before, but as they came closer, I realized these were different, worse. They looked human, or at least they had been once. Their faces were bloated and discolored, their eyes sunken and clouded over like corpses that had been left to rot. Their clothes were old, tattered, and stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. They didn't speak or make any noise other than their shuffling footsteps, but their heads were all tilted at the same unnatural angle, like they were trying to study me. One of them stepped forward. Its head snapped upright with an audible crack, and its mouth fell open in a grotesque, toothless grin. "He knows now," it said, its voice wet and gurgling, like it was speaking through a throat full of water. The others began to echo it, their voices overlapping in a sickening chorus. "He knows now. He knows now." I stumbled back, trying to put distance between myself and the things. My flashlight flickered again, and when the light steadied, they were closer. Too close. One of them reached out, its hand swollen and mottled with black veins, and grazed my arm. The touch burned. I screamed and lashed out with the flashlight, the beam catching its face. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural hiss that sent shivers down my spine. The others shrank back slightly, their milky eyes narrowing in what looked like fear. That's when it hit me. The light. It hurt them. I didn't wait for them to regroup. I bolted, shining the flashlight wildly in every direction to keep them at bay. The laughter was back now, louder than ever, but it was different, closer, more personal. It didn't sound like it was coming from the buildings or the shadows anymore. It sounded like it was inside my head, weaving through my thoughts, mocking me. As I ran, I noticed something strange about the town. The buildings, they weren't in the same places anymore. The saloon, which had been to my left earlier, was now on my right. The fountain in the square, which I'd passed twice already, was suddenly nowhere to be seen. It was like the town itself was shifting, rearranging around me, trapping me in some kind of maze. My flashlight landed on a small shop with its door hanging open. The sign above it read, "Henderson's Apothecary." I didn't think. I just ran inside and slammed the door behind me. The shop was a mess. Shelves were toppled over, their contents scattered across the floor. Old bottles, shattered glass, and strange herbs that gave off a sickly sweet smell. In the corner, a toppled display case held dozens of dusty jars filled with unidentifiable things floating in murky liquid. But what caught my attention was the back wall. It was covered in newspaper clippings, dozens of them, yellowed with age, pinned haphazardly to the wood. I moved closer, my flashlight casting long shadows across the wall, and began to read. The headlines were chilling. Mysterious disappearances continue in Cedar Pines. Entire family vanishes without a trace. Locals speak of curses and hauntings. Town declared abandoned after mass exodus. The dates on the articles were all from the 1940s and 50s, but the photos, the people in the photos, they looked exactly like the bloated, rotting things that had been chasing me. There was a photo of a man in a shopkeeper's apron, smiling with his family. I recognized him immediately. He was the one who had spoken to me in the square. Beneath the clippings, someone had scrawled a message directly onto the wall in thick black ink. They made a deal. We all pay the price. I didn't have time to process what that meant before I heard the door behind me creak. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around, flashlight raised. The mist had seeped into the shop, swirling in unnatural patterns, and through it stepped one of the figures. But this one was different. It was taller than the others, almost scraping the ceiling, and its body was covered in strange, jagged symbols that glowed faintly, just like the ones on the book. Its head was featureless, just a blank stretch of pale skin, but its presence was suffocating. The air in the room grew heavy, and I found myself struggling to breathe. It raised a long skeletal arm and pointed at me, just like the others had. But when it spoke, its voice was low and thunderous, vibrating in my chest. "The book is ours." I clutched the book tighter, instinctively stepping back. "What the hell is this?" I shouted. "What do you want from me?" The thing didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow step forward, and the symbols on its body began to glow brighter. The mist thickened, swirling faster, and the laughter returned, deafening now, drowning out every thought in my head. Desperate, I turned and ran up the back of the shop, bursting into an alley that hadn't been there before. The buildings around me twisted and warped, their walls leaning inward like they were trying to crush me. The ground beneath my feet was soft and wet, and when I looked down, I realized it wasn't dirt. It was flesh, pulsating and oozing with black liquid. I kept running, my lungs burning, my mind screaming for a way out. But no matter how far I went, the laughter followed. The shadow figures appeared in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach, herding me like cattle towards some unseen destination. And then I saw it. The church. It was directly in front of me, even though I was sure I'd been running in the opposite direction. The doors were wide open, and standing in the doorway was the tall, faceless figure, its glowing symbols now burning bright red. Behind it, I could see the altar. The manacles on its surface were moving again, writhing like snakes, and the air was filled with a sound I can only describe as breathing, deep, guttural, and inhuman. I had no choice. I stepped inside. The moment I stepped back into the church, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. I spun around, trying to pry them open, but they wouldn't budge. The laughter was back, louder than ever, cascading down from the rafters and spiraling up from the floorboards. It wasn't just the disembodied voices anymore. It was deeper, layered with something darker, something primal. The church was no longer the decrepit ruin I'd seen before. It had changed. The pews, once splintered and broken, now stood upright, but they weren't made of wood anymore. They looked organic, like bones fused together, their surfaces slick and pulsing faintly, with veins that glowed red. The walls dripped with a black tar-like substance that reeked of rot, and the warped cross at the steeple's peak cast a long jagged shadow that seemed to stretch toward me no matter where I stood. The tall, faceless figure was at the altar, its glowing symbols pulsing in rhythm with the book in my hands. The manacles on the altar were moving faster now, snapping and writhing, their chains clinking like a grotesque wind chime. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The altar wasn't empty anymore. Lying on its surface, bound in the twisting chains, was me. It wasn't a reflection or some hallucination. It was my body, my face, my clothes, even the sweat-soaked panic in my expression. The other me thrashed violently, trying to free itself from the chains, but its movements were jerky, almost inhuman. Its eyes, my eyes, were wide and bloodshot, filled with a terror I'd never seen before. Its mouth opened, and when it screamed, it wasn't my voice that came out. It was a chorus of voices, hundreds of them, layered and distorted, tearing through the air like a violent storm. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tighter. "What the hell is this? What is this?" I shouted, but the faceless figure didn't respond. It simply raised its hand and pointed at the book again. The pulsing glow on its body grew brighter, illuminating the twisted carvings on the walls, symbols just like the ones on the book, all converging toward the altar like veins feeding into a heart. The laughter rose to a deafening pitch, and then it stopped. Dead silence fell over the church, so thick it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The faceless figure stepped aside, and that's when I saw it. The thing that emerged from the shadows behind the altar wasn't human. It wasn't even close. Its body was massive, a bloated, writhing mass of flesh and bone that seemed to defy logic. Limbs jutted out at impossible angles, some ending in claws, others in twisted, half-formed hands. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was a featureless void, a swirling black hole that seemed to draw in the light around it. But the worst part was its mouth. It stretched across its entire body, jagged and uneven, lined with rows of crooked teeth that gnashed and clicked in a grotesque rhythm. From deep within its gaping maw came the sound of whispers, thousands of them, all overlapping, all speaking in a language that twisted my thoughts into knots. I could feel them crawling into my skull, digging into my mind, trying to pull me apart from the inside out. The thing leaned over the altar, its massive form blotting out everything else, and for the first time, I felt true, primal terror. My body froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't drop the book. All I could do was watch as the creature extended one of its grotesque limbs and pointed at me. "The price must be paid," it said, its voice a guttural rumble that shook the entire church. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No! No! I didn't agree to this. I didn't... But the creature's mouth twisted into what I could only describe as a smile, its teeth grinding together as it leaned closer. "The book binds you," it said. "You took what was ours. Now, you belong to us." The faceless figure stepped forward, raising its arms. The symbols on its body flared to life, and the book in my hands burned hot. So hot, I screamed and dropped it. The second it hit the ground, the chains on the altar shot toward me like snakes, wrapping around my arms, my legs, my chest. They yanked me forward, dragging me toward the altar no matter how hard I fought. My other self, still writhing on the altar, let out another guttural scream, its voice splitting into an ear-shattering cacophony. The chains pulled me closer and closer until I was face to face with the thing on the altar. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment it stopped thrashing. Its expression softened, not with relief, but with something worse, pity. And then the altar swallowed us both. I don't remember much after that, just flashes, pain, unimaginable pain, like my body was being torn apart molecule by molecule. Screams that I couldn't tell were mine or someone else's. Visions of the town, its buildings shifting and warping, the shadow figures multiplying, their featureless faces staring as the church itself twisted into the ground like a massive, gnarled root. When I came to, I was lying in the dirt outside the town, the sun rising in the distance. My car was parked a few feet away, the driver's door wide open. The book was gone, but the memory of it lingered like a scar on my mind. I climbed into the car, shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Cedar Pines was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of desert, as if the town had never existed. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I haven't slept. Not really. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Those shadowy figures, the faceless man, the thing with the gaping mouth. I hear the laughter, faint but constant, like it's coming from somewhere just out of reach. And sometimes, when it's quiet enough, I feel the chains wrapping around my wrists again, pulling me towards something I can't escape. Last night, I woke up to find symbols carved into my bedroom wall. They were faint, almost invisible, but they were there. The same symbols from the book. And when I looked closer, I saw that they weren't carved into the wall. They were carved into me. I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't know if I'll ever be free of Cedar Pines, or if it'll drag me back into its hell. But I do know one thing. I didn't make it out. Not really. And neither will you. I paid a dark web guide to explore an abandoned carnival. The clown animatronics weren't animatronics. I don't even know why I'm writing this. I feel like once I put this down, it'll become real. Like I won't be able to convince myself it was just some messed up nightmare anymore. But maybe you guys will believe me, or at least help me figure out what to do next, because I'm seriously losing my mind over what happened. Alright, so here's the deal. I've always been into weird, creepy stuff. Not in like a, I want to summon a demon kind of way, but you know, I binge watch those animated horror stories on YouTube and fall down Reddit rabbit holes about cursed places. If it's spooky, I'm probably clicking on it. So naturally, when I heard about this dark web guide thing, I was all in. You know how people talk about the dark web like it's some digital back alley filled with hitmen and black magic? Well, I wasn't stupid enough to try and hire a hitman or buy anything illegal. What I did do was pay for this guide who claimed they could take you to real-world locations you'll never find on Google Maps. They marketed it like some twisted Airbnb experience, but instead of cozy cabins, you got urban legends and haunted ruins. The listing I found: explore an abandoned carnival, deep in the woods, $300. It seemed sketchy as hell, but I couldn't resist. The guide's ad had pictures: rusted rides tangled with vines, a faded clown face peeling off the entrance gate, and these animatronic clowns in one of the fun houses. They looked broken, frozen in creepy poses. Honestly, the photos gave me the same vibe as those weird Chuck E. Cheese animatronics that stare at you like they know your secrets. But I was hooked. I wanted to see it for myself. I messaged the guide, who called themselves Ferrymen. Super original, right? And they got back to me fast. Almost too fast. They told me the carnival was off the grid and only accessible through them. They'd send me coordinates and meet me at a gas station about an hour away from the site. Payment was upfront via Bitcoin, and there were no refunds. Normally, I'd have been like, nope, sounds like a scam. But the reviews were oddly convincing. People talked about how legit Ferryman was, like they delivered exactly what was promised. The creepy locations, the thrills, the nightmares afterward, stuff like that. So, being the idiot I am, I sent the money. The day of the adventure came fast. I told my roommate I was going camping for the weekend. Didn't mention the whole abandoned carnival in the woods thing because she probably called the cops on me. I packed my flashlight, a portable charger, snacks, and pepper spray. You know, in case the ferryman turned out to be some psycho. The meetup point was this dingy gas station off some back road that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. There was a busted old McDonald's across the street with boarded up windows and one of those grimy playgrounds no kid should touch. I almost chickened out right there. But then this beat-up van pulled up and out stepped ferryman. I'd been expecting some sketchy old dude in a trench coat, but nope. This guy looked totally normal. Mid-30s, brown hair, flannel shirt. He could have been someone's dad picking up groceries. He smiled, all casual, and said, "You ready to see something you'll never forget?" Looking back, I should have just turned around and left. The drive was weird. Ferryman kept the radio off, and the silence made the forest outside feel even darker. There weren't any streetlights, just endless trees that seemed to close in on us the deeper we went. I tried to ask questions, like how they even found this place, but Ferryman dodged everything. "You'll see," was all he kept saying. After about an hour, the van lurched to a stop. We were in the middle of nowhere. No buildings, no signs, not even a trailhead. Ferryman handed me a flashlight and pointed at the trees. "It's a short hike from here. Follow me." The air felt heavier as we walked. Like, you know when a thunderstorm's about to hit and the air gets that weird electric charge? It was like that. I could hear twigs snapping under our feet and something rustling in the bushes, but Ferryman didn't seem to care. He just kept moving, like he knew exactly where he was going. Finally, the trees started to thin, and I saw it, the carnival, or what was left of it. The entrance gate was this giant metal arch with the words "Starry Nights, Carnival," barely legible under all the rust and dirt. One side of the gate had collapsed, and vines crawled all over it. Beyond it, I could see the tops of broken rides, like the skeletal remains of a Ferris wheel and the twisted tracks of a roller coaster that led into the trees. Ferryman handed me a walkie-talkie and said, "I'll be at the van. You've got 2 hours. If you're not back by then..." He trailed off, grinning like he knew something I didn't. I didn't even have time to ask what he meant before he disappeared into the woods. I'll admit, at first, it was kind of cool. Creepy, yeah, but cool. The place looked exactly like the pictures, frozen in time, like everyone just packed up and left one day. There was a ticket booth near the entrance, still full of faded carnival tickets. The roller coaster cars were stuck mid-loop, hanging like they were waiting for someone to push them the rest of the way. And the clown animatronics? They were just as creepy in person. Big, bulbous heads, peeling paint, and wide, cracked smiles that didn't feel like smiles at all. But here's the thing. As I walked deeper into the carnival, I started to notice stuff that wasn't in the pictures. Like, there were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading to one of the food stalls. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It wasn't just that musty, abandoned smell you'd expect. It was metallic, like blood. I told myself it was probably just animals. Maybe some raccoons got into a fight or something. But when I shined my flashlight at the food stall, my heart dropped. There was a clown standing there. Not an animatronic. A person, dressed as a clown, with dirty, oversized shoes and a torn suit covered in mud. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing me, with their head tilted to one side, like they were trying to figure out what I was doing. I froze, whispering, "Hello?" like an idiot. No response. Then they took a step toward me. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the clown. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam jittering across their face. If this was some kind of sick prank Ferryman had planned, it was working. But deep down, I knew this wasn't part of the deal. This felt wrong. The clown took another step forward. The sound of its shoe crunching the dirt was weirdly loud, like everything else around us had gone completely silent. No crickets, no wind, just the sound of my breathing and those damn oversized shoes dragging across the ground. "Stay back," I said, my voice cracking like a 12-year-old. I pulled out my pepper spray, fumbling with the cap. The clown didn't stop. They tilted their head the other way, like a dog hearing a high-pitched noise. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could make out their mouth, a red smear stretching ear to ear. Not like makeup, more like paint. Blood? I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to get close enough to figure it out. And then they laughed. It wasn't one of those cartoonish clown laughs, either. It was this low, guttural sound, like they were choking on it. My legs screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I swear my brain short-circuited in that moment. All I could think was, this isn't happening. This isn't real. Then, out of nowhere, the walkie-talkie on my hip crackled. Ferryman's voice came through, calm as ever. "You good out there?" That snapped me out of it. I snatched the walkie and shouted, "There's someone here. A clown. Is this a joke?" Silence. I glanced back at the clown. They'd stopped walking, standing about 20 feet away now, swaying slightly, like they were waiting for something. Ferryman's voice came back, but it wasn't calm anymore. It was clipped, almost panicked. "Listen carefully. Don't run. Whatever you do, don't run. Back away. Slowly." "Are you kidding me?" I hissed, gripping the spray so tight my fingers ached. "What the hell is going on?" "Just trust me," Ferryman said. his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you run, you'll regret it. They'll know. They'll know." That phrase hit me like a brick. I wanted to scream at him, to tell me what was happening, but I didn't have time to argue. The clown took another step forward, their body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet with tangled strings. I did what Ferryman said. Slowly, I started backing away, keeping my flashlight trained on the clown. My heart was hammering so loud, I was sure they could hear it. Each step I took felt like walking a tightrope over a pit I couldn't see the bottom of. The clown didn't follow. I thought maybe I was in the clear until I heard it. Laughter. Not from the clown in front of me. This was coming from somewhere else, deeper in the carnival. High-pitched giggles echoing through the broken rides and rotting food stalls. Then another laugh. And another. They were overlapping now, a chorus of distorted voices that didn't belong to anything human. I whispered into the walkie, "What the hell is this place?" Ferryman didn't answer. I kept moving, my flashlight darting around as the laughter grew louder. I passed a carousel, its faded horses frozen mid-gallop. One of them had been snapped in half, leaving jagged wood where its head used to be. The rusted poles creaked in the breeze, or at least I thought it was the breeze. But as I passed it, I could have sworn one of the horse's eyes followed me. I tried not to look back. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you, and every instinct screams to turn around? Yeah, that times 10. But I knew if I looked, I'd lose it completely. The clown wasn't laughing anymore, but I knew they were still behind me. I could hear their shoes scuffing the dirt, following my every step. The giggles from the carnival kept getting closer, though, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the clown wasn't the only thing I needed to worry about. I passed a row of food stalls, the signs faded and unreadable. Most of the counters were covered in moss and debris, but one of them looked off. The surface was clean. Not untouched by time, clean. More like someone was here recently clean. On the counter sat a half-eaten corn dog, still fresh. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Greasy, salty, and so out of place it made my stomach churn. There were bite marks on it. Human bite marks. I swung my flashlight around, the beam catching movement just at the edge of my vision. Another clown. This one was crouched on top of a stall, their head poking out from behind a broken sign. Their makeup was smeared, their eyes glassy and unfocused, but their mouth, it was open, too open, like their jaw had been unhinged, stretching wider than any human jaw should. My legs finally decided to listen to my brain, and I started running. Remember how Ferryman said not to run? Yeah, screw that guy. Every instinct screamed to get the hell out of there, and I wasn't about to die, just because he told me not to. The second my feet hit the ground, the laughter erupted into chaos. It wasn't just the clowns anymore. It was this weird, guttural growling mixed with metallic screeches, like machinery grinding against itself. The sound came from everywhere at once, and no matter which direction I ran, it felt like I was getting closer to it. I sprinted past the Ferris wheel, its carriages dangling like broken Christmas ornaments. Something was moving inside one of them. I didn't stop to look. The roller coaster tracks loomed ahead, disappearing into the trees. I thought maybe if I could get past the edge of the carnival, I'd be safe. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There was a body hanging from the tracks. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. The way it dangled, limp and lifeless, almost didn't seem real. But then the flashlight caught its face. The skin was pale, stretched tight, over a hollowed-out skull. The eyes were missing, just black sockets staring down at me. And the worst part, it was still wearing a ferryman hat. The walkie crackled again. "Stop running," Ferryman's voice hissed, but it wasn't coming from my walkie this time. It was coming from the body. Before I could even process that, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw a hand, thin, bony, and impossibly strong, pulling me toward the dirt. It wasn't attached to anything. I screamed, kicking at it with everything I had, but it wouldn't let go. More hands started clawing out of the ground around me, pale and clawed, digging into the earth like they were pulling themselves out of a grave. The laughter was deafening now, blending with Ferryman's voice, repeating, "You shouldn't have run. You shouldn't have run." I yanked my ankle free and bolted toward the woods. My flashlight flickered, then died completely, plunging me into darkness. I could still hear the clowns behind me, their heavy footsteps and wheezing laughter closing in. I don't know how I made it back to the van. 1 second, I was running through the trees, branches clawing at my face, and the next, I was collapsing onto the gravel parking lot. Ferryman was there, leaning against the van like nothing was wrong. "You ran," he said, shaking his head. "Big mistake." "What the hell is this place?" I shouted, grabbing him by the shirt. "What the hell are those things?" He just smiled. "You wanted an adventure, didn't you? I'm back home now, but I don't feel safe. I keep hearing laughter outside my window at night, and every time I close my eyes, I see that ferryman hat dangling from the roller coaster tracks. I think I brought something back with me. I thought I'd feel safe once I got back home. I really did. There's something about locking your own door, crawling into your own bed, and staring at the ceiling that usually makes the world outside feel smaller, like it can't reach you. But not this time. Not after what I saw. Not after what followed me. Let me back up. The ride back from the carnival was eerily quiet. Ferryman didn't say a word, not even his usual cryptic crap. He just drove, eyes glued to the road, like he was trying to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was back there. I wanted to press him for answers, demand to know what the hell I just saw, but something about his silence made me keep my mouth shut. When we finally pulled up to the gas station where I'd left my car, Ferryman turned to me. His face was different now. It wasn't smug or confident like before. He looked scared, and I swear, for a second, it almost seemed like he wanted to warn me. "You were lucky to get out," he said, his voice low. "Don't go back. Don't even think about it. And if you start noticing things that don't belong, don't ignore them. Don't try to fight it. Just stay out of the dark." I opened my mouth to respond, but he just drove off, leaving me standing there with my flashlight and a million unanswered questions. When I got home, it was just past midnight. My roommate, Kara, was asleep on the couch, surrounded by an army of half-empty takeout containers. I didn't wake her up. I didn't want to explain why I looked like I'd just survived a war zone. My clothes were covered in dirt. My face was scratched up from running through the woods, and my ankle was still throbbing from where that thing grabbed me. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and crawled into bed without even bothering to shower. For a while, I just laid there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was over, that whatever ferryman had dragged me into was left behind at the carnival. But then the noises started. At first, it was subtle, just a faint creaking, like the sound of a swing moving in the breeze. I figured it was nothing, just the house settling or the wind outside. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like something heavy was dragging across the floorboards in the living room. I sat up, my heart pounding. Kara was a heavy sleeper, but not that heavy. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping toward my bedroom door. "Kara," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The creaking stopped for a second, replaced by this low, rhythmic sound I couldn't quite place. It was wet, almost sticky, like someone dragging a mop across tile. I opened my door slowly, the hallway stretching out in front of me, like a tunnel. The light from my phone barely reached the living room, but I could make out Kara's shape on the couch. She was still there, still asleep, but something was wrong. There was a shadow behind her. It wasn't hers, though. It was too big. It stretched across the wall, the edges flickering, like it wasn't fully solid. And then I saw it move. "Kara," I called again, louder this time. The shadow froze. For a second, it just hovered there, like it was deciding whether or not to acknowledge me. And then, slowly, it turned. I didn't see a face. Thank God I didn't see a face, but I could feel it staring at me. My chest tightened, and I realized I wasn't breathing. And then Kara moved. She sat up, rubbing her eyes groggily, completely oblivious to the thing looming behind her. "What's your deal?" she mumbled. "Why are you creeping around?" "Behind you," I stammered, pointing like a total idiot. "There's something." She turned to look, but by the time her eyes adjusted, it was gone. Just like that. No sound, no trail, nothing. "What the hell, dude?" she muttered, lying back down. "You need to stop watching those horror stories before bed." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to scream that I wasn't imagining things, that something from that carnival had followed me back. But the look she gave me, half annoyed, half concerned, shut me up. She wouldn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. The next day, things got worse. It started with small stuff. I woke up to find my closet door wide open, even though I always keep it shut. My phone charger, which I swore I left on my nightstand, was coiled up on the floor, like someone had been playing with it. And then there were the balloons. Yeah, balloons. I found one in the kitchen that morning, a bright red balloon tied to one of the chairs. Kara thought it was some kind of prank. "Very funny," she said, rolling her eyes. "What? Did you go to a kid's birthday party or something?" "I didn't put that there," I said, my voice shaking. She just laughed. "Sure, okay." I popped the balloon and tried to move on, but they kept showing up. One in the bathroom, another in the hallway. By the time I found the fifth one, this time in my bedroom, tied to the foot of my bed, I was ready to burn the whole apartment down. But it wasn't just the balloons. The noises were back too. At night, I'd hear faint giggling coming from the vents, like someone was crawling through the walls. My TV turned on by itself, flickering between static and some old black and white cartoon I didn't recognize. The characters were clowns. Of course they were clowns, but their faces were twisted, distorted, like they'd been stretched out of shape. I tried calling Ferryman. His number was disconnected. By the third night, I was spiraling. I hadn't slept, I hadn't eaten, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Kara went out for the evening, leaving me to deal with whatever was happening on my own. Around midnight, the power went out. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, when everything went dark. My first thought was that it was a normal outage. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the breaker box. But as soon as I opened the door to the hallway, I froze. The red balloons were back, dozens of them, floating just above the floor, filling the hallway from end to end. I swear, they hadn't been there a second ago. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw something moving between the balloons. Something tall, with arms that didn't bend the right way. And then the laughter started again. Quiet at first, almost playful, but it grew louder, more distorted, until it sounded like screaming. I ran back to my room and locked the door, shoving my dresser in front of it for good measure. I could hear the balloons popping one by one, like whatever was in the hallway was coming closer. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I held my breath, listening. The air was so thick, it felt like I was drowning in it. And then I heard it. A voice, low and gravelly, whispering from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't have run." When Kara got home the next morning, she found me curled up in the corner of my room, clutching a kitchen knife. The dresser was still barricading the door, and there were scratches, deep, jagged scratches, etched into the wood. She didn't ask any questions. I think she could tell I wasn't ready to talk. But here's the thing. When she opened the front door to leave for work, she found something waiting on the porch. A ferryman hat. Kara quit asking questions after the ferryman hat showed up. Honestly, I think she just didn't want to know. She took one look at it, turned pale, and muttered something about crashing at her boyfriend's place for a few days. She told me I should get some rest, and left me there, alone, with whatever nightmare had clawed its way into our lives. I didn't blame her. If I could have escaped, I would have. But something told me I wouldn't be able to run far enough. Whatever I'd brought back from that carnival wasn't going to let me off that easily. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. The ferryman hat was still sitting on the porch, like a sick joke. I thought about burning it, but something about the way it just sat there made me nervous. I was afraid if I touched it, I'd make things worse, if that was even possible. Instead, I locked every door, every window, and barricaded myself in the living room with a bat. The power had come back on earlier that day, but I didn't trust it. I kept all the lights off, except for a single lamp, the kind of warm glow that felt just safe enough without feeling like a target. At around 1 a.m., the air changed. You know how it feels right before a storm hits? That electric stillness, like the world's holding its breath. It was like that, but wrong. My ears popped, and for a second, it felt like the walls were closing in. Then I heard it. A knock at the door. Not a loud, aggressive knock. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't in a rush. 3 soft taps, and then silence. I sat there, clutching the bat like it was going to do me any good, staring at the door. My phone was in my lap, but I didn't dare call anyone. What was I supposed to say? "Hi, yeah, there's a ghost clown on my porch. Can you send someone?" The knock came again. 3 taps, just like before. This time, I stood up, my legs shaking so bad I thought they might give out. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. The knocking stopped, but I could hear something now. Scraping, like nails dragging down the other side of the door. Slow and deliberate, the sound vibrating through the wood. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The scraping moved, traveling down the length of the door and then around the edges, like whatever was out there was feeling for a way inside. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. My brain was screaming at me to run, but where was I supposed to go? The carnival had followed me here. It wasn't outside anymore. It was everywhere. I realized how true that was when I heard the first balloon pop. It came from the kitchen, a sharp, sudden burst that made me jump. Then another, and another. It wasn't just one balloon this time. It sounded like an entire room full of them, popping one by one, like some invisible hand was walking through them. I gripped the bat tighter and forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, every step taking me closer to the kitchen and farther away from the relative safety of the living room. The light from my lamp barely reached into the hallway, but as I turned the corner, I saw them, balloons. Hundreds of them, filling the kitchen from floor to ceiling, their glossy surfaces reflecting the faint light from the window. They weren't there before. I know they weren't. I would have noticed them when I locked up earlier. The popping had stopped, replaced by that wet, sticky sound I'd heard before. It was coming from somewhere inside the mass of balloons, something moving, dragging itself closer. I could see the balloons shifting, like something was crawling through them, pushing them aside as it made its way toward me. I don't know what possessed me to step into the kitchen. Maybe I thought if I could just see it, just look at whatever was happening, it would make more sense. But the second I stepped inside, the balloons started popping again, faster this time, bursting in rapid succession until I was surrounded by the noise. And then I saw it. It wasn't one of the clowns from the carnival. It was worse. It was wrong. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, like the ones you see in department stores. Its skin was smooth, shiny, and deathly pale, like porcelain stretched too thin over wire. Its face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth surface that somehow felt more horrifying than any grotesque grin. But the way it moved, it wasn't human. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, its joints creaking as it unfolded itself from the floor, rising to its full height. It was holding something, a balloon, but not just any balloon. This one was black, its surface shifting like it was filled with smoke instead of air. The creature tilted its head, almost like it was curious, and held the balloon out to me. I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to run, to swing the bat, to do something, but all I could do was stare. The balloon hovered in front of me, pulsing like a heartbeat, and then, without warning, it burst. The sound wasn't like the other balloons. It wasn't a pop. It was a deafening crack, like a gunshot, and for a split second, the entire room went black. When the light from the window came back, the creature was gone. But the kitchen wasn't empty. Standing in the doorway was one of the clowns. Not an animatronic. Not some guy in a suit. This one was real. I could see the veins under its pale, painted skin, the yellowed teeth beneath its too wide grin. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have run." I don't remember how I got out of the house. One second, I was in the kitchen, and the next, I was outside, sprinting down the street like my life depended on it. Maybe it did. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station a few blocks away, collapsing onto the pavement in front of the clock, who stared at me like I was insane. I tried to explain what happened, but the words wouldn't come out. How do you even begin to describe something like that? I sat there, shaking, until the sun came up, and the clerk finally asked if I needed to call someone. I told him no. I don't think anyone can help me. When I got back to the house, the ferryman hat was gone, So were the balloons, the scratches on the door, and any sign that the clowns, or that thing in the kitchen, had been there. But I know it wasn't a dream. I know what I saw, and I know it's not over, because when I walked into my bedroom, I found something waiting for me on the bed. A single black balloon. Tied to the string was a note. It read, "You can't run forever." The note tied to the black balloon wouldn't leave my mind. You can't run forever. The words carved themselves into my thoughts, looping endlessly, like a bad song you can't shut off. I sat on my bed, staring at the balloon, waiting for it to move, pop, or just disappear, like the rest of this nightmare. But it didn't. It just floated there, swaying gently in the still air of my room. I wanted to scream, cry, do something, but I was too tired, too broken. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. Ferryman was right. I'd made a mistake, and now it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. I don't know why I went back to the carnival. Maybe I thought I could end it. Maybe I thought I could find Ferryman and force him to fix it. Or maybe I just wanted to face it head on, to rip the bandage off and see what was really waiting for me in the dark. The drive was longer this time. The roads seemed different, like they were stretching out, pulling me deeper into the woods. My GPS cut out halfway there, leaving me to navigate by memory, and somehow I still found it. The entrance gate was just as rusted and broken as before, the clown face on top now completely peeled away, leaving behind a hollow, grinning skull. I stepped out of the car, clutching my flashlight and the bat I'd brought as a last-ditch defense. The air was heavier this time, pressing down on my chest with every breath. The carnival was waiting for me, and it wasn't hiding it. As soon as I crossed the gate, the lights came on, not all at once, but in a slow, eerie ripple. First, the carousel lit up, its skeletal horses frozen mid-spin. Then the roller coaster, its rusted tracks glowing in the flickering light of bulbs that should have burned out years ago. The Ferris wheel followed, groaning to life as it turned lazily, its carriages swaying like they were full of invisible passengers. And then the music started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the creaking rides and rustling leaves, but it grew louder with every step I took, the warped notes of a carnival tune dragging me forward like a leash. The whole place felt alive now, not abandoned, but wrong, like it had been waiting for me to come back. The laughter started soon after, not the high-pitched giggles from before. This was deeper, harsher, echoing from every direction at once. I gripped the bat tighter, spinning in circles as I tried to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, shifting in the corners of my vision, moving too fast for me to catch. I don't know how long I wandered. The carnival seemed bigger this time, the pathways twisting and looping back on themselves like a maze. Every time I thought I was getting somewhere, I'd find myself back at the carousel or the ticket booth, the same torn posters flapping in the wind. And then I saw them, the clowns. They were everywhere now, stepping out of the shadows, their painted faces glowing in the sickly light of the rides. They didn't move like people. Their bodies jerked and twisted, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Some of them crawled on all fours, their oversized hands dragging them across the dirt. Others towered over me, their long, spindly arms reaching out like they wanted to pull me closer. I swung the bat at the nearest one, the wood connecting with a sickening crack. Its head snapped back, but it didn't fall. It just laughed, this wet, gurgling sound that made my skin crawl, and kept coming. I ran. Again, I know I shouldn't have, but what else could I do? There were too many of them, their laughter chasing me through the maze of broken rides and rotting food stalls. I could feel them getting closer, their footsteps pounding against the ground like a drumbeat. I stumbled into the funhouse, slamming the door shut behind me. The mirrors inside were cracked and dirty, their reflections warped and distorted. My flashlight flickered, the beam bouncing off the glass as I tried to find a way out. But the laughter didn't stop. It echoed through the funhouse, louder now, closer. And then I saw it, not in front of me, but in the mirror. A clown, not one of the ones I'd seen before. This one was different, taller, with arms so long they dragged against the floor. Its face was blank, just a smooth surface with no features, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul. It stepped closer, not in the mirror, but in the room. The reflections all showed it moving in unison, each step bringing it closer and closer until it was inches away. I swung the bat again, but it passed through the air like smoke. The clown didn't laugh. It just reached out, its hand closing around my wrist. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked at the gas station, where Ferryman had first picked me up. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. My bat was gone, as was my flashlight. The only thing left was a single balloon tied to my rearview mirror, black, shifting like smoke inside. I thought I was safe. I thought it was over. But when I got home, the carnival was waiting for me. Not the whole thing, just pieces. The lights flickered like the rides. The music played softly in the back of my mind, even when there was no sound. And the clowns, I see them now, in the corners of my vision, in the shadows of my room. They're always watching. And the worst part, they're getting closer. I don't know how this ends. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the carnival never really leaves you. Maybe that's the point. You can't run. You can't hide. You can only wait for it to claim you. I hear them laughing now. Outside my door. Inside my head. The black balloon is still sitting on my dresser, waiting for me to pop it. I don't think I will, because whatever's inside is worse than anything I've seen. You can't run forever.